You're listening to the Ctrl-Alt-Secure podcast, where we talk all things cybersecurity. I'm your host, Valentina Flores, CEO of Sentry. Welcome. Hi, everyone. I'm Valentina Flores, CEO of Sentry, and this is the Ctrl-Alt-Secure podcast, where we talk all things cybersecurity. And we have a really cool guest today, Boggs, president of ReputationUs, and we're going to be we talk all the time about technical fallout and how to prevent the technical sides of hacking. But what Casey's going to talk about today is when you get hacked, what happens to your reputation afterward? How do you come back from that kind of event? So really excited because I think it's a very underrated and under talked about part of cybersecurity. So Casey, really excited to have you here today. If you want to give your background and what you do.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. Background, I've been doing this thing called public relations for 20 years now. My background's with two large PR firms, and then I was in-house at AIG as a director of PR for AIG during the financial crisis, and then started my own firm about 15 years ago. And for the most part, we've handled the ugly side of public relations. That's reputation management and crisis mitigation. So been doing this for quite some time, and then backed into the cybersecurity world for over 12 years, just because of the nature of the beast.
And right now, do you do mostly cybersecurity, or you do a little bit of everything in terms of reputation?
A little bit of everything. Yeah, today's world is moving at quite the breakneck speed, certainly on the current administration, to issues that are talking about taking a stance, to issues happening with HR. But cybersecurity certainly lurks its head often for what we do.
Like I said, we talk about the technical fallout from cyber attacks so often, but the reputational damage is just as severe, if not more, a lot of time for companies. Why do you think this is such an underestimated side, or why are people not talking about this more?
Yeah, I like that question. In fact, we posed that question when we did a recent cybersecurity survey to understand and gauge what the impact is on an attack to really a company, but also the consumer confidence. And so as I listen to your question, Valentina, I think through what the results were of that survey, and it simply said that if an attack happens, who's to blame, right? Mm-hmm. Is it if you can point the finger at the malicious actor, or you put the finger and then point the finger at the company? And almost a 50-50 split. I think it was 54% said the malicious actor, the other 46% said the company is to blame when the attack happens. So the onus, while seemingly it's easy to say, well, shoot, we were a victim. No, today more than ever, you're not a victim. You should be prepared for such a thing. Granted, it's not your fault for it happening, but it's your fault for not being prepared. So the fallout from all that is reputational damage. Were you prepared? Are you protecting your customer or your patients in the world of healthcare? Are you protecting their most valuable piece, and that's their data, that's who they are? And if the answer is no, because of an attack, then that will certainly have ramifications on a company's reputation.
Yeah, and you mentioned pointing the finger at either the hacker or the company, and even within the company, every person within the company is pointing a finger at a different person, and it's just this blame game instead of trying to figure out, like, what do we do now? How do we go forward? And, if you own a company, or you're responsible, or even if any person in the company, you are responsible for cybersecurity, and it's everyone's job. Okay. And doesn't matter whose fault it is, it's your problem now, and you have to be prepared and fix it. So are there any kind of common mistakes that you see companies making when responding to attacks? Because I think we all kind of see things in the media. It's kind of been chaos the last few years. We see a lot more of it. Are there any big mistakes?
Where do I begin? No, but there's quite a few mistakes. And I'll share just two broader categories, and then it can go more to the specifics of sorts. But we look into the world from a public relations side as the who, the what, the why, the when, and the where. So I bring up the who first, because to blame is to say, okay, if something happens, who do you need to communicate to make sure that the issues being mitigated or the issues being addressed? And then the who could potentially be customers, right? So I think the fault sometimes lies in who needs to be communicated to first. And if you don't necessarily know who that answer is, that's number one out of your training toolbook. So what I mean by that more specifically is that we just learned about an attack. right? Should that go to the hands of the IRT, incident response team, or the executive level, communications, or who is that, right? So that's the who. And then once you find out who is impacted, the issue that we see and how the reputation piece plays a key role is that the who is not being communicated to long after the fact after attack happens. So then the second aspect of that is the when. We see a lot of the missteps happen as far as the timing of the when it's communicated. So you hold this information, hopefully just kind of go away, or you're trying to resolve it. I get it. We understand that sometimes you don't necessarily want to be too cavalier and communicate when you necessarily don't know all the details. However, if you hold on to that for 2, 3, 4 days, a week, now that's on you.
And 20 years ago, you might have gotten away with holding it, but nowadays, probably not so much. Is there a standard window, or is it just dependent on the situation and kind of the circumstances of the company?
Yeah, it depends on the situation is the best way of saying it, but there's no harm in saying it happened. We've experienced it. We're investigating it, and we're going to be communicating regularly to let you know what's actually happening. Now, that can be very succinct, and it doesn't necessarily be harmful at all, but there's no harm in telling folks that's what's happening in our book. But yet, in general, if you don't do it, there is harm because, hey, we need to know about that. Why didn't you tell us that earlier? We would have been okay if at least you told us this is happening.
Yeah, and I mean, we do incident response plans all the time with companies, or we see them as part of our process with pen testing. And very, very rarely is the communication side talked about. It might be like one little line in the incident response plan. Everything else is about the technical. And I mean, obviously, we want to contain and we want to do all those things, but someone should be responsible for that side of it. And we very rarely see it in incident response plans. So I'm glad we're having this talk today and kind of going into that. So what does like a well coordinated smart incident response plan look like from the PR side? Like what should companies be working on?
Yeah, I'll package this into a few areas here. One is just simply have a plan of attack and developing a plan, which essentially is a playbook, right? If you think about a sports metaphor, you want to have a playbook before you actually go into the field of battle, right? So what's that playbook look like? And how does it correspond with the IRT, right? If in the event that something does happen, what's their playbook and how does it mesh well with the communications playbook? For the communication side, it's essentially identifying who is responsible for bridging between the incident itself and to the communication side. And then who's responsible for communicating to the parties that are affected. And that could be executives, that could be staff, that could be the customer or patient, depending on what you're talking about here. And then later on, who's communicating to the external factors. And that's, certainly social media, or it could be vendors, it could be media, all those different aspects. So having a plan is the first thing out of the blocks, right? Who is responsible for when this actually happens? The second piece is to develop, a training mechanism. We simulate these trainings quite a bit for companies. Now, there's no doubt you brought up pen testing, but this is a pen testing on the level of how would we communicate if this actually happens? And not to be, again, too cavalier on going out there and communicating, but let's strategize first. Who do we need to have on that team? And that's the IRT, it's the insurance. We make sure the insurance has been notified because they actually might be bringing in their breach team or the panel to help in this capacity. Legal, we work completely in correspondence with legal. And what I mean by that is we are making sure that what can we legally say, when can we legally say it, and what can we do to ensure that we're informing the affected parties without having any self-inflicted wounds. So,
and is that when the incident happens, or ahead of time, or both?
Ideally? It's ahead of time. It's ahead of time. And I'll give you an example, if I can, of when this actually happens. We represent an NBA team, which I have to go without saying who they are, but we represent a pretty large NBA team, and they do this on a quarterly basis. So they have an IRT and a communication side because there's a lot of different pieces to this NBA team. But part of this is want to make sure that they have all the proverbial people on the right bus when this actually happens. And when it becomes what we call a priority one attack, meaning it has a lot of different ramifications here. They want to make sure that The legal teams brought in immediately. The insurances were protected on that side. Obviously, the IRT and how they're communicating throughout the communication side. So different scenarios, we concoct different parts of what would happen if, and who should be connected with, and what if about this. And our job throughout that process is to say, hey, did you think about communicating to them? Or boy, you missed a step here. And that's the whole idea, is you want to fail on your time, not during the fog of war.
Yeah, of course. Right. And I know we talked about transparency, and obviously transparency is really important. Where is the line between, and obviously it depends on the legal team and the insurance in that conversation, but where's that line usually between honesty and transparency and then oversharing when an incident is still kind of fresh and happening?
Yeah, transparency is always a good fallback to things, and it's okay not to have all the answers. And I think it's really important to have communications that are real, authentic, and saying that we are finding information out as much as possible and what is actually being done. So that gives some degree of comfort to those who are affected by the incident, right? And that's when the legal and the communication piece tap dances with each other, because frankly, in the past, legal doesn't necessarily want to say too much at all, if not anything, but we're saying, hey, we need to communicate something. So we find a common ground to share information. Now, a little bit of information could be a dangerous thing, right? So we want to make sure that when we're communicating, it gives them a sense of what we're doing and what they should the audience should expect next. So that gives you a degree of fluidity of the communications, and it gives me, if I have a customer, a sense that something's in control here, right? We're getting the most latest information. Conversely to that, Valentina, the opposite is don't communicate. Let the information flow as it is. Social media or customers calling or typing in, hey, I'm having an issue, and no one responding, that's a hot mess. So if you have those communications set in stone ahead of time or on a regular basis, that's good transparency, but that's good practice and it's good form.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure social media, I'm sure you get pulled in all the time, and misinformation has already started to spread. It's already kind of taken over, and then you're kind of there to clean up the mess. So
that's right.
Getting proactive, getting ahead of it is a huge component of this, right?
Yeah, it's hard to put toothpaste back in the tube when it's actually out there, because to demystify some false information that's actually out there, there's a couple different lone wolves who might be sharing information that's false. But if there's a theme going on there, I heard this, and you're not communicating, that vacuum of communication is being filled by the wrong people.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And how does it matter? Does it matter like what industry you're in? Obviously, like healthcare, tech, public sector. How does industry affect, or does it how you should respond?
Yeah, I think the biggest change in that is regulation. There's some parts where it's highly regulated, like in the banking industry or the financial services industry or accounting, those types of things. They require a certain degree of communications on a regular basis, right? Some don't, but certainly the healthcare industry is important because of HIPAA and other shareable laws that, we want to make sure that if your information is breached, we need to communicate, right? So industry by industry, there is a slight nuance, but in general, it's still the same form of communicating often, being transparent, and being smart about when and how you are communicating.
And if a company, obviously my job is to try to prepare companies so they don't get attacked. But if they do get attacked, or when, and your team comes in, how does that, I guess if you do early, you're transparent, you do all the right things in terms of this PR, how does a company's transformation look like afterward? Like, are there success stories? Is everyone pretty much taking a hit, or how does that process go?
Yeah, success sometimes is that nothing happened, right? No one afterwards celebrates a good cyber attack. They only are crying after a bad one, right? So a success really looks like, hey, we communicated throughout the process. It resolved itself. We were transparent in regards to what happened, who was affected, and we corrected the problem. We offered other things like, free credit scoring, or we had all hands on deck with our customer service to answer these kind of questions, nuanced as they might be. We took a very sort of approach to handle that problem. That's when people are saying good. They're not going to give you credit or give you a star rating on how well you handle the part, but what they will do is not say anything. That is a victory. And it's weird to celebrate that, but that is usually an indicator.
Yeah, and you move from that victim mindset that we talked about earlier into, hey, we had this problem, we did this, and this, and
That's right.
Giving your clients confidence that you're handling it. I think that's one of the most important things. Like, it's not really about the hack; it's about your response to it, and are you taking proactive measures? What have you done? What are you going to do? What are your next steps?
Yep.
Just gives everyone more confidence around it. And
That's
do you
right.
think? I mean, obviously, this area has changed a lot over the last few years, not only on the social media and the visibility side, but also on the cyber attack side. I mean, both sides are kind of running rampant at the same time. Do you feel like companies are being held to a higher standard, or is there a difference now? Do you think it's going to change going forward in terms of what companies have to do in these incidents?
Yeah, let me go get my crystal ball and find out exactly how this is all going to play out. But all joking aside, I do see a transformation on the communications flow and how quickly it's actually happening. What I mean by that is what we're seeing is the attacks are being affected or being impacted by those who are, hey, I just learned about this. This just seems funky. What should I do? And the communications channels are coming in from social or through the other channels communication to the company, right? And that seems like a higher volume. So in an ideal world, you learn about the attack through the IRT and you resolve the issue and then you communicate accordingly, that kind of outside in approach to it all. But no, it's coming in from the inside and going out and like, oh, wow, we heard about this through different channels. That seems to me from our examples, what we're dealing with at a different volume, a different pace, a different dynamic than we were originally brought in for. Meaning, 10 years ago, it seemed to me, okay, we've heard about this. What are we going to do about it? Now, no, other people are hearing about it. What are we going to do about it? So that pace has changed, and I think it's going to continue to change because of the lightning fast way of people are communicating and sharing information.
Yeah. And, I love to leave everyone with, if there was one thing that they take away from this that's kind of easy to do that they could do this quarter to start getting more proactive with this, especially for companies that think, it's never going to happen to them, or even if it does, like they're the victim and, they just haven't really thought about this reputation loss yet. What would be your advice for those companies?
3 words, prepare, prepare, prepare. And I say that because the preparation is very telling on how good you will respond from the incident itself on the technology side and then the communication side. And the whole purpose of preparing is to fail or learn from, right? I used the sports metaphor earlier, but it applies here now that you have a game plan, you test it, you go to practice, and then game time, you have no idea what's going on in the game. Any game is going to be different. That's why we watch games, right? Because there's just too many different variables. In an attack, there's so many different variables, but at least you understand who the players are, who's doing what and when, and you can at least navigate and call timeouts if necessary to regroup and re-strategize. But if you don't necessarily have that game plan or even that practice ahead of time, then you are destined for failure on the playing field.
Well, one thing I really like that you said earlier was about being authentic with it. And I think a lot of people think preparing me, asking ChatGPT for, a breach response and keeping that saved in a doc somewhere. And, the response side is not just that phrase or that, that messaging, but it's like you said, who's communicating it, what's our timeline, who are all the different people. And it's part of the incident response plan. So just as teams are establishing this plan on the tech side and the executive side, have your entire team come together and really, you have to cover all these different sections, because hacking does not just affect the technology stack, it affects the entire company. It's a business problem, not just a tech problem. So we have to be proactive with all sides of it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought the word authentic because of all things, is last year's Merriam-Webster's word of the year being authentic. And authentic, people are smelling out what's authentic and what's not. The beautiful thing about AI and ChatGPT and all these different other applications, which we're all using, which is good, but they can smell out, who wrote that, right? And or is that just an automated way to communicate? That's People need more than that, and you might be called out as far as how you handled it. Even though you are communicating, it's more lines of that seems to be inauthentic, and you might be paying for that piece of it.
Yeah, if your apology sounds fake, that's sometimes worse than saying nothing.
Right.
I've always used M-Dash, and now that ChatGPT uses it, now I can't even use
That's
it
funny
anymore.
you said that, or have a lot of bulbs out of nowhere. You're like, wait a second, what's going
I
on
just
here?
like
Who's
bold
making
font, and now I can't even use it because people think it's
it? That's right. Yeah,
awesome. Well,
people are
Casey,
catching on.
yeah, this was really helpful, even just for me to hear. And I think everyone listening is going to get a lot out of it. And I hope everyone takes away that, it's not the end of the world if you get hacked. Be transparent, authentic, open about it, and be proactive with it. Figure out that plan ahead of time, and the reputation loss will be a very different situation after. So, Casey, thank you so much
Yes,
for joining today.
my pleasure.
Thank you.